After over a decade of putting together the puzzle pieces of my family tree and locating long-lost cousins around the world, I finally took my first trip to Europe to meet them. Ever since I was little, I had always been intrigued by my living relatives. And when I started doing genealogy, finding living relatives always seemed to be at the top of my list of things to do. I always wondered what they looked like, what are their personalities, and most importantly, are they similar to me and the family I know? And things really took off in 2009 when I made my first contact with cousins outside of the United States who were actually living in New Zealand. But after that, the floodgates opened and I was finding cousins all around the world. England, the Netherlands, Ukraine, Australia, South Africa, Israel, Canada, and all across the United States. I quickly realized that a lot of my cousins lived in London and Amsterdam, and that just really pushed me to want to go. But even though I had a strong desire to go to Europe, just for years, I just never made it happen. But in recent years, things really changed, and I started to put going to Europe further and further up on my list. And then I found out that one of the genealogy conferences that I was already planning to attend was going to be held in London in 2023. So this was the perfect opportunity to visit. Not only would I be able to meet all of these cousins in London that I'd connected with over the years, but I realized that if I scheduled enough time, I could make my way to Amsterdam. Now, in all honesty, Amsterdam has been the #1 city I have wanted to visit for years. On my mom's side, we come from the Amsterdam Jewish communities, and we have a lot of lines that actually trace back to the founding of the community in the 1600s. The Jewish communities in Amsterdam have also become the main focus of my genealogy research and has really become one of my expertises. Now I finally had a chance to go. Once I was able to work out my availability with my work, I was able to schedule 17 days for the trip. And while it was a long amount of time, I still had a decent checklist of things that I had to do, while also incorporating the conference, moving between hotels, and all of the touristy stuff that people do in London and Amsterdam. But either way, I had a main checklist of things I wanted to do in London and in Amsterdam. For London, #1, have a family reunion. Now, the way that I'm defining a family reunion here is really basic and just thinking of it in terms of having multiple relatives that are from different sides of the family tree, so from different branches. So even just myself and 2 other cousins, each from a different branch of the family tree, would be something I'd consider a family reunion. Although I obviously wanted it to be much bigger. Now, this was something I got to work on quite well before I went on my trip because, I had to get things figured out. So I was able to get one of my cousins in London to help me with that. #2, attend Shabbat services at my ancestral synagogue, Bevis Marks. #3, visit ancestral homes in London, especially if the original building exists, or at least part of the building. Being a genealogist, I had a lot of addresses for the family when they were living in 19th century London, and having checked before on Google Maps, it seemed that some of them were still the original building. Now, my list for Amsterdam was pretty similar. #1, have a family reunion in Amsterdam. Now, there are fewer cousins living in Amsterdam than there are in London, so it was going to be a lot harder, but I was still trying to get something set up that would be multiple cousins hanging out at once. #2, attend Shabbat services at my ancestral synagogue, Esnoga. #3, visit my ancestral homes. Same thing as in London, I had a whole bunch of addresses for where my family lived while in Amsterdam, mostly in the 1800s, but dating back to the early 1800s. And it also seemed some of these buildings were the originals. But in Amsterdam, I also had a 4th. Visit the Bethlehem Cemetery in Oudekerk aan de Amstel. The records from this cemetery were the first records where I ever felt a true proficiency in genealogy. Basically, the first time I ever felt like I was doing research where I was building trees and making connections that others hadn't made, it was using these records. And this was 2009 when I first started getting into these records. But on top of that, it was the cemetery where I had the most documented ancestors. No other lines in my family ancestry come even close to knowing how many ancestors I have buried in this cemetery and where they're buried. So the main goal for this trip, check each one of these items for London and Amsterdam. Day 1. My flight left in the afternoon, actually being delayed and then rerouted through Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. And going through Charles de Gaulle was somewhat overwhelming, especially having originally been scheduled to fly up to Boston and then over to London. It was the first time I remember ever going through a passport control, as I had been on cruises when I was younger, but that was when I was a lot younger and I don't remember any passport control stuff. But it was super confusing, and the French version of the TSA was not helpful at all. In fact, they were even more confusing. It wasn't actually until I was sitting at my gate waiting for my plane to London that I realized I was in Europe for the first time ever. Kind of a weird spot to realize. I really couldn't see Paris, the weather wasn't good, and the fog was super heavy, so it couldn't really see past the airport. The airport was also surprisingly humid, but as time went on throughout my trip, I started to realize that this seemed to be more of a European thing, because I guess the whole AC thing, where we have a lot of AC in the US, but Europe, they don't use AC as much. But I also quickly realized why there's a stereotype that French people have really bad BO. And it was definitely multiple people on that plane. Once I arrived at Heathrow, it was nothing like I had been warned. I was honestly expecting a packed airport, really annoying long lines, a difficult passport control and customs area, and possibly the roughest airport experience I've ever had exiting an airport. Honestly, I think part of it was I had heard worse things about Heathrow than Charles de Gaulle, so I expected it to be even worse than Charles de Gaulle. Instead, Heathrow was almost completely empty, and I basically just walked straight through customs, no passport control, nothing. It was honestly so ridiculously basic that I was worried that I was doing something wrong. Also kind of disappointed I hadn't gotten a stamp in my passport. But I breezed on through, went straight to the tube, and was able to hop right on. And it worked out perfectly because my hotel was literally right above the Tower Hill station. It was still quite early and I couldn't check into the hotel yet, so I had them check my bags and just walked around outside in the parks nearby the hotel. I decided to sit down on a bench when a bird flew up and started hanging out with me. I was kind of even joking to myself that maybe this bird was actually an ancestor of mine coming to welcome me to London for the first time. Also, these two flies landed near me and began working on expanding their own family tree. At this point, I should mention that it's kind of hit or miss on how well I documented different parts of my trip. I brought a new camera for the trip, a DJI Pocket 2. Affiliate link in the description if you want one and want to help support the channel. But I was a bit intimidated and tired and didn't want to have to deal with it, so I kept it in my luggage and just didn't worry about it at this point. But slowly throughout the trip, I got much more comfortable with it, so you'll probably notice as time goes on, I have a bit more footage of different things, and not as much just me talking. Anyway, once I was able to check in, I went upstairs and I passed out. I woke up a few hours later feeling quite refreshed, and the first thing to do was to meet with David Mendoza, a Sephardic genealogist based in London who I had known for years, but we had never met in person. It was absolutely amazing to finally be able to meet David, and it was the first of many similar meetings where I was meeting friends and cousins who I'd known so well over the internet, but had never met in person. We met outside of my hotel, where David then took me on a short walking history tour of the area before we went to go check off one of the items from my checklist: attending services at Bevis Marks. My family had arrived in London from Amsterdam in the 1860s, but would only stick around until the 1890s when they would leave for the US. In the grand scheme of things, my family's time in London was actually pretty short. But during their time in London, they had been members of Bevis Marks, the famous Spanish and Portuguese synagogue of London. And even though they were there for only a short time, Bevis Marks seemed to have made a big impact on the family, as I had even heard the name growing up, even well before I got interested in family history. And while my line of the family left London, many other lines stayed part of the Bevis Marks synagogue, even until today. Arriving to Bevis Marks was an absolutely amazing experience, although it was quite odd since I had seen so many photos of it for so many years. My biggest surprise was at how hidden Bevis Marks seemed to be. being behind a gate and then surrounded by all of these newer buildings. You basically have to know it's there to be able to find it. I knew about the many issues facing the synagogue because of developers constantly trying to build newer and bigger buildings all around it, and it was surprising to see how much had already been done. The synagogue was absolutely beautiful inside, and as soon as I walked in, I could just feel a strong connection. The attendance for services was quite light, but there were still a few people inside, and I began talking to them. David took me over to sit in the seats that we believed were the seats that my ancestors had been designated to sit in. It was interesting at how fast it felt services just began. Having grown up in a Reformed Ashkenazi temple in the States, it was very interesting to see the Spanish and Portuguese Sephardi minhag. Minhag basically meaning the specific traditions and customs to each different group of Jews. But a big part of minhag is how the prayers are read and the services are held. So for my first experience in the Spanish and Portuguese Sephardic tradition, it was very interesting. And the thing that stood out the most about it for me was how fast they read the prayers. It honestly felt sometimes like they were trying to race or something. But it was also amazing to hear the cadence they gave when singing certain prayers. After the Kiddush, everyone introduced themselves, and I was surprised how many others were visitors like myself. In fact, it seemed most of the people attending were visitors. Even though this was a small group of people, their origins ranged from all over the world. Although I seemed to be the only visitor with an ancestral connection to Bevis Marks. But after chatting a bit, everybody said their goodbyes, and we headed out. From Bevis Marks, I went with David to his flat for a home-cooked meal, which actually was my first official meal in London, and technically my first official meal in Europe. And it was quite an amazing meal. The dessert was something I had never had before, something called pavlova, but it was the first of many things that I would try throughout the trip, which is somewhat unusual for me because I am a very picky eater, and trying stuff for me can be difficult. But after an amazing meal and long discussion about all sorts of genealogy topics in the upcoming conference, I made my way back to the hotel to try to get a good night's sleep. But once I was back at the hotel, jet lag hit me hard. Even though I felt super tired, it was like my energy levels all of a sudden were reboosted, and there was no way I was going to be able to get to sleep. Next thing I knew, it was 6 a.m. and I figured I might as well take advantage of the free hotel breakfast. So I went downstairs and had some of my technically first English food. So I had my first English bacon, I had my first bangers, I forgot what else I had, but it was some stuff that was kind of familiar but slightly different. Granted, this was in a hotel, so I'm sure it's nowhere near the same as the traditional stuff. But after eating and getting back to my room, I passed out. Day 2. I ended up waking up in the early afternoon, but it slightly worked out because I had planned kind of for this, basically just a basic day, and so it ended up not being that bad because I had nothing planned to do. Just things I wanted to check out that weren't super important. I spent the day mostly walking all over the place, kind of aimlessly. At first, I headed up to Spitalfields Market and Brick Lane, only with a single bagel shop in mind, although I did want to try more. But walking up and down the streets, I felt quite overwhelmed. I think it was kind of a mixture of just being tired and jet lagged, and then also having some social anxiety, especially when traveling alone. But I ended up walking all over the East End, all throughout multiple markets, and the only place I actually stopped was the bagel store. Looking back on that day, I definitely wish I had stopped and gone out and done more and just, tried to push myself a bit. But hopefully next time in London, I'll get to redo walking around East End and try a lot of the stuff I wanted to stop and try. But I really didn't do much else for the day. I did walk across the street, walk around Tower of London, walk across Tower Bridge. I did end up going to a Tesco's Express, which was a lot of fun, being able to see a grocery store with all of these various items that were kind of familiar from seeing on YouTube videos, but never having seen them in person. So I got a few things to try, although I definitely had to hold myself back because I have somewhat of a serious sweet tooth. So I was honestly pretty close to buying almost the whole aisle. But after a day of walking aimlessly, once I got back to my hotel, Jet lag didn't seem to kick in, and I was able to get a good night's sleep. Day 3 to day 7. Day 3 was the first day of the conference, and that meant changing hotels. Seemed easy enough. Take the tube to Westminster, walk across the bridge, hotel is right there. But this must have been rush hour because the tube was absolutely packed. And having all of my luggage with me, transferring from one hotel to the other, I was kind of on edge. And walking across the bridge was kind of worse. It was just as packed. There were all of those ball and cup scammer sort of things set up. And originally I had thought that walking across the bridge, I could check out the sights and look at all the different things, Westminster Abbey, and look across the Thames and all of that. I did none of that. I was dead focused on getting across that bridge. By the time I got to the end of the bridge, I probably looked like a madman because I was just so annoyed with everybody just not getting out of the way, and just, it was not fun. But once I was into the hotel, I was able to calm down, kind of stress out a bit, and soon I found myself saying hello to all sorts of people who were there for the conference. Some who I had met before, some who I knew about from being online but had never met in person, and others who knew me and I didn't know them. The conference, which is officially called the IAJGS International Conference of Jewish Genealogy, is about 5 days, so I'm not going to go over every single day in this video. Lots of talks, lots of meetings, lots of genealogy, but I'm just going to cover some of the highlights. One of the biggest highlights of the conference was that this was the first time that myself and the other administrators of the Sephardic Diaspora group on Facebook met in person all together. The admins being David Mendoza, Tone Thielen, Michael Waz, and myself. This also led to one of the largest in-person gatherings of Sephardic genealogists in many years, with representatives from all over the world who were studying many various Sephardi communities. This conference also had the 4th ever genealogy deathmatch, which was the first one ever held in person. For those unfamiliar, the genealogy deathmatch is where 2 genealogists go head to head, proving each generation of their family going back as far as they possibly can. This year had Alex Kalzareth versus Michael Moritz, and I was actually Alex Kalzareth's coach. Alex ended up winning, but I think the whole conference won in the end. After the death match, a big group of us walked to a nearby pub, and this group was quite an amazing group. There's Michael Waz, who has been a guest on the channel since the early days in 2017, Caitlin Hollander, co-founder of Hollander Waz Heritage Services, Randy Schoenberg, another friend of the channel, who helped recover art looted by the Nazis, which was then made into the film called Woman in Gold, where Randy was portrayed by Ryan Reynolds, Michael Moritz, a lawyer and genealogist who runs Moritz Research, Avraham Grohl, the executive director for Jewish Gen, Jordan Oslander, a forensic genealogist who runs the Genealogy Detective, Alex Kalzareth, who most recently made big news for pulling records which uncovered some of George Santos's lies, Alec Ferretti, a serious force in Reclaim the Records who is currently being sued by Ancestry, and of course, myself. Say hello, Daniel.
Hello.
The rest of the conference was a big mix of talks, meetings, and just hanging out with tons of other Jewish genealogists. I've already named a few, but there were so many genealogists from all around the world, so I'll just show a bunch of the footage I have from walking around the conference. I also shot a special Professional Genealogist Reacts with other genealogists at the conference reacting to a video, which was released a while back, so be sure to go check that out on my reaction channel. Day 8. I left the conference hotel on Friday, the day after the last day of the conference, and I was off to my next hotel in Hyde Park. Part of the reason I wanted to switch hotels was because the conference hotel was crazy expensive, but also I figured it'd be cool to go and stay in another part of London, being that I had been in the East End, then I had been in Westminster, so now I was going to be near Hyde Park. But once I arrived at my hotel, let's just say I was not impressed. My room was super small, dirty, old, and just uncomfortable. I decided to just stick it out for a bit and relax, partly because I was going to be leaving for my next activity soon, meeting my cousin Becky. Becky is my second cousin, and we grew up going to family events together, especially since our great-grandmother Jenny lived to be 109. Since Becky now lives in London, we decided to meet up to get some dinner and do a little family history touring together. We met up at Italy, which was in a super packed area of London, and it's another place that the next time I go back to London, I definitely have to spend more time checking it out. We ended up eating at this cool outdoor restaurant that was like kind of a food truck, but kind of not, and it was just really, really cool, really good food. But after dinner, and especially since it was a Friday, we were off to attend services at Bevis Marks. Now this was Becky's first time attending services there, so it was really cool to be able to attend together. Granted, they do have the old school style of having women sit upstairs, men sit downstairs, so we didn't sit next to each other during services. But still really cool to be able to go together. I'd also told David that Becky and I would be attending, so he came too, so that he'd be able to attend and meet another Noon's cousin. After services, David joined Becky and I as we went to check off another item on my list, visiting an ancestral home. The address was the building where our shared third great-grandparents had lived in the 1800s, and it was also the building where our shared second great-grandfather, Abraham Nunez Vaz, had been living as a kid. It was also really cool thinking about the fact that since we were walking from the synagogue, we were likely taking a path very similar to the path our ancestors took many a time going from synagogue back to home. Now the building was only partially original from when the family had lived there. It was obvious that there was a lot of modern updates and construction on the inside, but still at least the original facade on the outside. Becky and I snapped a few photos together in front of the building before we headed off. Day 9. For day 9, I had my last major checklist item for London planned: the family reunion. This was something I was able to get set up thanks to the help of my cousin Susie Gortler, and we're expecting about a dozen people, if not more. I was obviously hoping for the more. Unfortunately, the day started out a bit rough because I didn't get a good night's sleep, the room was just so bad, and then when I went to go try to take a shower, I found out that the shower was broken. Although thankfully still usable. It ended up taking me a bit longer than I was hoping to get ready because how difficult it was dealing with this small room and all of this stuff. But I figured, well, I'll just plan to get an Uber. It's probably going to be faster than taking public transportation. I don't mind spending a bit more. I just want to make sure I'm there on time, not feel rushed. But that was a mistake. I ended up waiting for over 30 minutes just trying to get an Uber driver to accept the ride. Over and over and over. But finally, after 30 minutes, I had a driver accept it, and as he was taking me to the restaurant, I asked about it, and I found out that more than likely my rides were being denied because I was going to an area of London where they get charged extra if they drive over a certain street or something like that. So a lot of these drivers were just saying no because they didn't want to have that risk. Luckily, I only arrived a little bit late, but that was kind of terrible for me, being I had wanted to arrive early. The reunion was in Victoria at a restaurant that Susie had helped get set up through one of her friends, and they had even set up a special spot for us up the stairs away from everybody else. When I arrived, there were about 8 cousins all sitting around a table, and I almost instantly recognized everybody. It was honestly surreal. Everyone present represented 3 main branches of the family, with all of our most recent ancestral couple being Jacob Nunez Vaz, born 1759 in Amsterdam, and Simcha Senior Coronel, born 1766 in Amsterdam. Basically, we all descended from a different son of this couple. Cousin Susie Gortler and David Nunes came from my branch of the family, descending from son Abraham Nunez Vaz. I descend from Abraham's son Raphael, while Susie and David descend from Abraham's son Aaron. 2 of the cousins in attendance descended from son Isaac Nunez Vaz. Rebecca Masterton, a well-known British Islamic scholar, and Laura House, the other professional genealogist in the family, who works with Ancestry UK and has been featured in multiple BBC programs about genealogy. Cousin Suzanne Harding represented the 3rd branch of the family, descending from son Moses Nunez Vaz. We all took a bunch of photos, and I even got a short video clip while showing my cousins the new camera. although I now wish that I'd taken a lot more video using this new camera. I'd also brought my laptop to go through the family tree, and a few of the other cousins had also brought their family trees printed out, and various photographs and all sorts of fun items. A few more cousins joined as time went on. The Young family, who are also descendants of the same branch as Susie and David. We all stayed around talking for a long time about all sorts of things, and I honestly think we may have overstayed our welcome in the restaurant, although they were extremely courteous and very welcoming. As we were all leaving, there was a serious discussion about having a much bigger Nunes Vaz family reunion in the future. As I headed back to my hotel, I felt quite accomplished, having now completed all of the main checklist items that I had for London. By the time I was back to the hotel, it was still somewhat early, only 4 p.m., so I was looking forward to possibly doing a bit more, but I ended up spending a good bit of time in the hotel dealing with the room issue and trying to get that changed because the first room was just so bad. They ended up giving me a few options, including one room that would require upgrade charges, but honestly, the difference between that room and the others was so worth the upgrade charges. So I got that one. By the time I had that all set with and my luggage in the room, I decided to just sit and relax for a bit and just try to catch my breath. For dinner, I ended up trying Nando's, which was definitely worth the hype. I would love to have a Nando's near me in the US. But I also did a bit more grocery tourism and checked out a Sainsbury's grocery. Of course, I ended up picking up more candy, a bit more than the last time, but I tried some really good stuff. My favorites being the Wispa Golds and the Roundtree Jelly Tots. That's what they were called. Day 10. Day 10 was my last full day in London, and for my last full day, I was going to meet up with somebody from my own history. My nanny Louise from when I was just a little toddler in California. I hadn't seen her for years, last time being when I was probably about 7 or 8 when my family was living in Illinois and she came to visit. We decided to meet up at the British Museum because it was one of the touristy things that I had on my list of stuff to do, and it seemed like it might be a good place to be able to go check stuff out and talk. We ended up walking around the museum for a few hours, chatting, catching up, and just checking out all of the interesting artifacts the British have looted from across the world throughout the centuries. Although it was super packed, especially the ancient Egypt section, and it probably wasn't necessarily the best place to catch up, but still a fun experience. From there, we just walked around London, going to Trafalgar Square, walking up the Mall to Buckingham Palace, going through the Green Park to Piccadilly Circus, and then up to Soho. The plan from there was to go and get a Sunday roast dinner. I'd originally scoped out this restaurant called Blacklock, which had been in a few YouTube videos and really seemed up my alley, having a massive plate of meat that they bring out to you. But unfortunately, they were booked up and I had misunderstood their booking practices on their website, so we ended up having to go to a different place. Although before we went to the place we actually ended up eating dinner, we stopped at a pub to get a drink, and that was probably where we did our best catching up. Before our dinner, we ended up going to Fallow for their roast dinner, and I would later learn that that's a restaurant that's actually quite a hot spot for people to go to, so it was kind of interesting that we were able to get in so luckily, although we definitely had a chance that they were going to say no. But it was a lot of fun being able to see Louise for the first time as an adult, and it was also a lot of fun being able to catch up on the past 20 years. Louise had even brought photos that she still had from when she had been in California with my family, and I also learned a bit more about how she had become a nanny for my family. But once we finished eating, we said our goodbyes and I headed back to my hotel where I was trying to get some good sleep for my travels tomorrow to Amsterdam. I was quite excited for this train ride, taking the Eurostar from St. Pancras Station all the way to Amsterdam. I was especially excited because we were going to be going through the Channel, and I was also going to be able to see the French and Belgian countrysides and the Netherlands countrysides. But also kind of fun being able to say that I have been in France and Belgium, although technically I'd been in France on my first day in Europe. The Channel ended up not being very exciting, although in retrospect I'm not quite sure what I was expecting. It's not like they were going to have walls where you could see into the channel and all of that. The train ride was so quick and easy, it felt like it was way faster than it really was. We ended up actually even being an hour late. But I really wish we had high-speed trains in the US like that, because it would make traveling so much easier in long distances than always having to do air travel. But arriving in Amsterdam was quite jarring. As I said, we were an hour late. It was busy. Everything was in Dutch, even though I had been working on learning Dutch and still working on it. Ik spreek een beetje Nederlands. But I also wasn't sure if I needed my passport, my train ticket, my ID, or what. But even in all the confusion and chaos, the second that I stepped off the train, there was just this feeling like I was home. There was just something about being in Amsterdam felt right. I made my way through the station, ended up going the exact correct path, figured out that I just had to have my train ticket printout to scan to get through the little customs thing, went outside, went down into the metro, able to easily buy my metro card, and took that straight to my hotel, which once again was right next to the station. One of the wonderful tricks I learned from those wonderful YouTube travel channels: try to find hotels which are near the metro stations. And this place was called the Social Hub. Originally, I guess it had just been a dormitory for students, but sometime in the past few years, they had opened it up more to the public for long-term stays and hotel stays, kind of like I was treating it. It was extremely contemporary with lots of cool art and crazy colors and all sorts of avant-garde sorts of stuff all over the place. There's this one really interesting hallway that was completely painted red, and there was just something so weird feeling about walking through it. But it was also in a pretty good spot because it was just outside of the city, so if I needed to walk to the city, it would have been easy. But most importantly, the metro station was right there, so I could easily get in and out of the city or anywhere else that the metro went. But after checking in, I dropped off my luggage and I was already running outside to meet my cousin, Oz. Now that's it for part 1 on my trip to Europe, but if you want to check out more videos of mine, be sure to check out this one right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.